The morning it happened, a Tuesday, people were stuck in traffic, drinking bad coffee, arguing about football scores, and complaining about rent. Nobody was looking up. Then the shadows came. Not darkness, not like clouds. Something worse. Something wrong. The kind of shadow that made animals go silent and birds drop from the sky mid-flight. In Lagos, a bus driver stopped his vehicle in the middle of a bridge and just stared upward, mouth open, engine running. In Mumbai, a woman hung laundry on her rooftop and turned around to find every neighbor on every rooftop around her doing the exact same thing, all of them looking up, none of them speaking. In orbit above Earth, 7 ships materialized from what physicists would later call a fold in local spacetime. Each one was roughly the size of a small country. Their hulls were dark, metallic, carved with geometry that made the eye slide away, shapes that didn't quite resolve into anything the human brain was built to process. They didn't roar into existence. They simply appeared, the way a bad thought does, suddenly there, impossible to ignore. Every telescope on Earth swung toward them. Every military radar lit up simultaneously. In Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, and Nairobi, phones rang at the same second. The United Nations Emergency Protocol, a document that had been drafted, revised, argued over, and shelved 47 times since 1961, was activated for the first time in history. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes from shadow to full global government response. Historians would later call that terrifyingly fast for a species that once took 3 weeks to agree on a sandwich. At the time, it felt agonizingly slow to the people in those situation rooms, watching those shapes hang in the sky like a question nobody wanted to answer. Then the signal came. It didn't come through any radio frequency, satellite dish, or military array. It came through everything simultaneously, televisions mid-broadcast, phones mid-call, radios mid-song. Every speaker on Earth played the same thing at the same moment. A tone first, clean, resonant, clearly artificial, and then a voice, translated flawlessly into every living human language at once. The voice belonged to High Emissary Vulcan of the Thre Dominion, senior representative of the galactic sovereignty. A coalition of 47 spacefaring civilizations spanning a region of the galaxy, so vast it made the human imagination quietly give up trying to picture it. Vulcan was by any measure impressive. His species stood nearly 3 meters tall, with pale, iridescent skin that shifted color with emotion, currently a deep, authoritative gold. His voice carried the practiced calm of a being who had delivered this exact speech, on one variation or another, over 60 times to 60 different civilizations. He had never once not gotten what he came for. He explained the Sovereignty Compact. His tone was generous, even paternal. The galaxy, he said, was dangerous. Ancient threats moved in the dark between stars, things that had ended civilizations far older and stronger than humanity. The sovereignty existed to protect emerging species from those threats. All Earth needed to do was sign an agreement. 40% of its natural resource output, ceded governance of everything beyond the asteroid belt, and a moratorium on faster-than-light research without sovereignty licensing. In exchange, humanity would receive protection, guidance, a seat at the galaxy's table, a small seat certainly near the back, but a seat nonetheless. He finished speaking. There was a 2-second silence. And then, from Earth's unified response channel, patched through the Secretary General's emergency communications suite, came a sound Vulcan had genuinely never heard in his 62 years of diplomatic service. Laughter. Not polite laughter. Not nervous, confused laughter. Rich, full, genuine laughter. The kind that bends a person double. It lasted almost 4 seconds, and even when it faded, there was a warmth to it, a helpless, almost fond disbelief. The way a person laughs when someone makes an absurd claim with a completely straight face. Vulcan stared at his communications array. His staff stared at him. On the screen, the face of Secretary General Amara Osaibansu appeard, a Ghanaian woman in her mid-50s with close-cropped silver hair, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the expression of someone who had just heard the punchline to the world's most elaborate joke. She composed herself slowly, wiping her eye with one finger. She looked directly at the camera, directly at Vulcan, across the silence of space. "I apologize," she said, and her voice carried not a single molecule of apology. "Could you say that again? I want to make sure I heard you correctly." In 6,000 years of sovereignty expansion, across 62 civilizations brought into the compact, not one had ever responded this way. Not one. Vulcan's skin flickered gold fatting briefly to an uncertain pale green. Across Earth, in traffic jams and living rooms and hospital waiting areas and school classrooms where teachers had turned on the broadcast, 2 billion people watched their Secretary General look an alien diplomat in the eye and laugh at him. And slowly, in ones and twos and then in great rolling waves across every continent, they started laughing too. Amara Osaibansu had not planned to laugh. She was, by every professional measure, not a woman who laughed in crisis. She had negotiated hostage releases in 3 different conflict zones. She had held together a collapsing ceasefire with nothing but a satellite phone and stubbornness. She had buried colleagues and kept working. Laughter was not her default. But when Vulcan had finished his speech, when she had fully processed the serene, practiced confidence of a being who had looked at Earth, looked at humanity, and concluded they would simply comply, something broke loose in her chest that she could not hold down. She composed herself now, straightened her jacket, and looked at the alien emissary across 40,000 kilometers of empty space. "High Emissary," she said, "my name is Amara Osaibansu, Secretary General of the United Nations. I represent approximately 8 billion people on this planet, and I'd like to have an honest conversation with you. Is that acceptable?" Vulcan's color had returned to gold, but it was a thinner gold now maintained rather than natural. "We welcome Earth's formal response," he said carefully. "Good," she folded her hands on the table. "Let me tell you a little about us." What followed was not a speech. It was not a diplomatic statement. It was something rarer and more unsettling, a story. Quiet, specific, and devastating in its detail. She told him about the Black Death, 1/3 of Europe's population, dead in 5 years. And then she told him what happened after, how the survivors rebuilt, how the labor shortage shifted economic power to working people, how the horror of the plague cracked open the medieval world and eventually helped birth the Renaissance. Death had fertilized progress. She told him about the world wars, both of them. The industrialized slaughter, the cities reduced to rubble, the generation of young men fed into machines and not returned. And then she told him what happened after the Marshall Plan, the United Nations, the longest sustained period of international cooperation in human history, built deliberately from the wreckage. She told him about the nuclear standoff, 2 superpowers pointing enough warheads at each other to end complex life on the planet, holding that position for decades, each side certain the other might blink first. Neither blinked. Both survived, and eventually, carefully, they stepped back from the edge. She told him about pandemics, about climate shifts, about famines and droughts, and the long grinding poverty that had marked most of human existence for most of human history. And then she said, "We're still here." She let that sit for a moment. "We did not survive these things because we were protected," she continued. "We survived them because when the worst possible thing happened to us, we adapted. We are, High Emissary, perhaps the most catastrophically resilient species you have ever encountered. Every single disaster in our history has, eventually, made us more capable, more connected, and more dangerous." Vulcan was very still. His color had moved to something his staff didn't have a name for, a pale, luminescent blue that appeared in Thre physiology only in states of intense recalculation. "You face threats you cannot imagine," he said, and there was slightly less confidence in it than before. "I'm sure we do," Osaibansu said pleasantly. "We face things we couldn't imagine before, too. We didn't find them very relaxing, but we managed. She tilted her head. Can I ask you something personal, High Emissary? He blinked. You may ask. In your 6,000 years of doing this, how many civilizations told you no? A pause. None, he admitted. She nodded slowly. That worries me, not for our sake. She paused. For yours, you've only ever met scared people. You have no idea what to do with us. She ended the transmission politely, thanked him for his time, and told him she looked forward to further discussions. In the Sovereignty Fleet's command chamber, after the signal cut, nobody spoke for a very long time. Intelligence Director Shaveth had worked for the Sovereignty for 31 years, and he considered himself unshockable. He had assessed civilizations that communicated through bioluminescence, species that reproduced through collective dreaming, and one particularly memorable planet where the entire population had decided, independently and simultaneously, to simply stop reproducing as a form of political protest. Nothing surprised him anymore. By the end of his first full briefing on humanity, his hands were shaking. He had sent 12 analysts the previous night with a simple mandate: give me everything. By morning, they had returned with files that ran to 40,000 pages and a collective expression that he could only describe as haunted. The first problem was military. Human weapons technology was, by sovereignty standards, primitive. No energy weapons, no gravitational manipulation, no shield technology. These facts had led sovereignty analysts to initially classify Earth as a negligible threat, the same classification given to civilizations that had barely mastered atmospheric flight. What the initial analysis had missed was creativity. Human weapons didn't follow logical progression. They were weird, layered, redundant, and mutually reinforcing in ways that made Shaveth's analysts deeply uncomfortable. Humanity had conventional explosives and nuclear weapons and hypersonic missiles, and orbital kinetic impactors and cyber warfare infrastructure and psychological operations departments, and most alarmingly, a long-documented history of adapting enemy technology and using it better than the enemy did. They fought on every domain simultaneously: land, sea, air, space, information, economics, culture, and they thought of all of them as one battlefield. They don't have better weapons than us, one analyst wrote. They have more ideas about weapons than we have ever had, and they generate new ones at a rate our models weren't designed to track. The second problem was psychological. Every civilization the Sovereignty had ever encountered showed the same response curve to existential threat: fear, paralysis, negotiation, compliance. It was a universal pattern, rooted in the survival mathematics of intelligent life. When something bigger threatens you, you yield. You yield or you die. Humanity's historical record showed something profoundly different. There was a term in human psychology, post-traumatic growth, for the phenomenon where individuals became stronger, more purposeful, and more capable after surviving trauma. No sovereignty species showed this pattern at scale. Humanity showed it consistently, across millennia, across cultures, across every type of catastrophe. The bigger the threat, the harder they pushed back, not always immediately, sometimes after tremendous suffering, but they pushed back. One analyst, Junior Assessor Pirate Callas, 26 years old on her first major assignment, submitted a supplementary report that she almost didn't file because she thought it would end her career. It read in part, "I'm not certain the concept of acceptable loss threshold applies to this species in the way it applies to others. Human historical record suggests that in certain psychological states, particularly when defending territory or people they love, individual humans will absorb losses that would collapse the morale of any sovereignty military unit and continue fighting with increased, not decreased, intensity. This is not rational. This is not something our threat models account for. I recommend we treat this as our single most important intelligence gap." The third problem was social. Earth had no unified government. It had nearly 200 separate nations, dozens of competing alliances, and a political discourse so loud and fractious that sovereignty analysts had initially assumed the planet was in a state of perpetual civil war. It was not. When the ships appeared, those 200 nations had coordinated a unified response in 11 minutes. Callas filed a second note. They argue with each other constantly. They always have. And then, when something threatens all of them, they stop arguing. We do not understand the mechanism by which this switch occurs. We should find out before we do anything irreversible. Shaveth read the reports 3 times. Then he went to his superiors with a single recommendation: delay, take the 30 days, learn more before making any move. His superiors, particularly Fleet Admiral Draxon, told him to stop overthinking primitives. Shaveth went back to his office and quietly began updating his personal emergency protocols. Just in case, day 1 of the 30-day compact deadline passed quietly. Day 2, the same. On day 3, Vulcan moved 3 warships into low Earth orbit, a standard intimidation maneuver, precise and clinical. It had worked on every civilization they'd used it on. The sight of sovereignty cruisers passing over cities, visible with the naked eye even in daylight, tended to produce the desired psychological effect. What it produced on Earth was traffic. Not panic, traffic. People drove to open fields and hillsides and pulled over on highways to photograph the ships. Within hours, the 3 cruisers had been given nicknames on social media: Gerald, Big Bertha, and the small one, and someone had already made a song about them that had 40 million views by evening. Vulcan received this intelligence report and read it twice, slowly, wondering if there had been a translation error. Behind the humor, though, the machinery of human decision-making was running at full speed. The Emergency Global Summit convened in Geneva representatives from every nation, every military bloc, every major international body. The debate was exactly what it looked like from the outside: loud, fractious, and borderline chaotic. Small nations demanded their voices be heard. Large nations jostled for control of the response. 3 separate blocs threatened to walk out. One delegate actually did walk out, then came back 20 minutes later with coffee. From Vulcan's surveillance feeds, it looked like civilizational collapse. It wasn't. Beneath the noise, 3 things were happening with quiet efficiency. First, Earth's military commands were running coordinated readiness exercises that looked, on sensors, exactly like routine planetary defense drills, which they were, except they were also real. Second, teams of linguists, historians, psychologists, and xenobiologists were producing detailed analyses of the sovereignty's known behavior, looking for patterns and leverage points. Third, and most quietly, certain orbital infrastructure that had been categorized in public records as communications satellites and space debris management platforms were being remotely activated and brought to standby status. On day 7, the summit reached consensus. Not perfect consensus, not unanimous agreement, the kind of hard, painful consensus that 8 billion people could live with, which, in human politics, was as close to a miracle as it got. Oseibansu transmitted Earth's formal response. It wasn't a refusal, it was a counteroffer. Mutual recognition as equal civilizations, voluntary trade agreements, joint exploration partnerships, cultural exchange, a permanent diplomatic mission with full representative rights. No tribute, no resource surrender, no restrictions on human technological development. And quietly attached as Appendix D, marked for the High Emissary's personal review, shared in the spirit of transparency. A concise, 12-page strategic defense assessment. It contained no boasting, no threats, just facts, capability breakdowns, asset inventories, strategic doctrine summaries, the kind of document that militaries sometimes shared before a conflict as a final, quiet way of asking, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Vulcan read it alone in his quarters at 2 in the morning, his color running through a sequence of shades his attendants had never seen before. He didn't sleep. Fleet Admiral Draxon was not a subtle being. He was Mervathi, a species that had built its civilization on the principle that dominance, clearly established early, prevented the messier costs of prolonged conflict. He had subjugated 11 worlds. His methods were consistent: demonstrate overwhelming force immediately, remove any possibility of resistance from the target species' imagination, and collect compliance before hope had a chance to root. He had read Shavith's intelligence reports. He had dismissed them as the nervous overcaution of an analyst who had never held a weapon. He had read Appendix D. He had concluded that the humans were bluffing. On day 14 of the 30-day deadline, without informing Vulcan, without consulting the Sovereignty Council, acting entirely on his own authority as fleet commander, he ordered a demonstration strike. He chose the Sahara Desert, uninhabited. The strike was precise, controlled, a single high-yield gravitational pulse weapon, the kind that had leveled city-sized areas on resistant worlds. A warning shot, a reminder of what the fleet could do when it stopped being polite. The crater was 4 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. The shockwave flattened sand dunes for 80 kilometers in every direction. Seismographs across North Africa registered it as a magnitude 6.2 earthquake. Draxon leaned back in his command chair and waited for the human communication channels to explode with fear. They did explode, but not with fear. 11 minutes and 40 seconds after the strike. Exactly 11 minutes and 40 seconds. A response time that would be analyzed and reanalyzed in sovereignty war colleges for decades. 17 structures in Earth's orbital space that had not previously appeared on any sovereignty sensor array became visible simultaneously. They uncloaked in absolute silence, which somehow made it worse. They were not large by sovereignty standards. Human engineering was angular, functional, almost brutally practical, no elegance, no ceremony. But there were 17 of them, positioned with a geometric precision that the sovereignty's tactical AI flagged immediately as deliberate envelopment formation. They had appeared around the sovereignty fleet, not in front of it, not facing it. Around it, flanking the flanks, covering the retreat vectors. Alongside them, from Earth's surface, and from positions in low orbit, 23 smaller craft moved to intercept positions, quick, maneuverable, clearly designed for close-range combat. They moved the way the sovereignty tactical AI described as uncomfortably confident. Draxon's weapons officer spoke quietly. "Admiral, they have firing solutions on all 7 of our primary vessels." Draxon stared at his tactical screen. His jaw worked silently. Osaibansu's voice arrived on every channel simultaneously, the way Vulcans had arrived on every human channel 16 days ago. She had clearly been waiting for this moment because her voice was perfectly level. Not angry, not frightened. "Fleet Admiral Draxon," she paused just a beat. "You fired on our planet. I'd like to discuss that when you have a moment." Another pause. "We're not going anywhere." The 7 sovereignty ships sat in their envelope of human weapons, and for the first time in Fleet Admiral Draxon's career, he did not know what to do next. The standoff held for 72 hours. Neither side fired. No one moved. The sovereignty fleet and the human weapons platforms held their positions with a patience that the galaxy's news networks, which had, by this point, gotten wind of what was happening, described as either extraordinary discipline or mutual terror, professionally disguised. Both were accurate. Inside the standoff, invisible to both sides, something else was happening. For over a century, Earth had been broadcasting. Not deliberately, not a coordinated signal, not a message crafted for alien audiences. Just the runoff of human civilization. Radio waves, television broadcasts, digital communications, all of it leaking outward into space at the speed of light, in every direction, an ever-expanding sphere of human noise. Game shows and news broadcasts, and music and arguments and love songs, and scientific papers and comedy specials and football matches. It had been traveling for 100 years. Several species had received it. Most were too small, too distant, or too intimidated by sovereignty dominance to have done anything about it. But they had listened. They had translated, slowly and imperfectly, and they had formed opinions. A species that made music about heartbreak, that broadcast arguments between itself and then broadcast reconciliations, that told stories about its own failures and then kept going. This was a species that several marginalized civilizations had quietly decided they liked, in the abstract, from a safe distance. The standoff changed safe distance. Three of those civilizations, the Thre collective, the Venquire, and a species with an unpronounceable name that humanity would eventually nickname the Loom, made contact with Earth's communication array on day 2 of the standoff. Not military contact, not political contact. Something almost shy about it, a signal, carefully encoded with mathematical proof that it was intentional, that simply said, "We see what is happening. We are watching. You are not alone in your position." It offered nothing material. No ships, no weapons, no alliance, just "we see you." Osaibansu read the message 3 times, then quietly wept for about 90 seconds, then dried her eyes and told nobody. Inside the sovereignty, the standoff was tearing at seams that had been weakening for decades. The sovereignty was not one thing. It was 47 civilizations bound by treaty, tradition, and in many cases, the fear of what happened to those who left. Several of those 47 had joined the compact not eagerly, but because the alternative had been a demonstration strike on their own worlds. They had been compliant ever since. Quiet, careful. Draxon's unauthorized strike on Earth gave them something they hadn't had before, a legitimate grievance point. Because he had fired without council authorization, he had violated sovereignty procedure. That made him vulnerable. One by one, quietly at first, then louder, sovereignty member civilizations began formally requesting an emergency council session. On day 3 of the standoff, Draxon received a recall order from the Sovereignty High Council. He stared at it for a long time. Then slowly, his ships began to pull back, not retreating. The official statement would insist, repositioning. But everyone watching knew what it was. The human platforms held their positions for another 6 hours after the last sovereignty ship moved, just to be certain. Then they stood down. Vulcan, watching from his diplomatic cruiser, felt something he didn't have an easy word for, a kind of exhausted, complicated respect. The way you might feel watching someone survive something that should have broken them and come out the other side not harder, but clearer. He opened a private channel to Earth's diplomatic line and asked, very quietly, if Secretary General Osaibansu might be available for an informal conversation. No staff, no cameras, no recording, though both sides quietly kept their own. Just Osaibansu at a desk in Geneva, a cold cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink, and Vulcan in his private chambers aboard his cruiser, his color running low and steady in a gray-blue that his staff would later say they'd never seen on him before. Later, a Thessari cultural scholar would identify it as the color of genuine humility, an emotion Vulcan's species expressed as a physiological shift rather than a posture. "I owe you an apology," Vulcan said without preamble. "Several, in fact." Osaibansu looked at him for a moment. "I'll hear them. When I arrived here, I had no real intention of negotiating. The compact is not designed to be negotiated. It is designed to be accepted. The choice of language, the timing of the fleet's arrival, the positioning of ships in your orbit, all of it is engineered to make compliance feel like the only reasonable option." He paused. "We have done this 62 times. It has always worked. I told myself it was for the benefit of the civilizations we brought in. I am not certain I believed that. I am not certain it was true." Osaibansu was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" "You laughed," he said simply. "In 62 contacts, no one has ever laughed. I found it offensive at first, then I found it frightening. And then slowly I began to understand what it meant." He looked at her. "You laughed because you were not afraid. And you were not afraid because you have survived things that should have made your species afraid forever. I read your history, Secretary General, all of it. I read it more carefully than my analysts did." He folded his hands, a gesture he had picked up, unconsciously, from human diplomatic footage. "Your species has never been safe. Not once. Not for a single generation in your entire recorded history. And you are still here, and you are still reaching outward, and you are still, somehow, capable of laughing." He shook his head slowly. "We have been offering protection to civilizations for 6,000 years. You are the first species I have ever met that I genuinely believe does not need it." Osaibansu looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her cold tea, took a sip, made a face, and set it down. "So let's talk about what a real agreement looks like," she said. They talked for 72 hours. Not constantly. They slept, ate, took breaks. But they kept coming back, working through it piece by piece with the careful patience of two people who understood that what they were building mattered far beyond themselves. The original compact was formally withdrawn. Not suspended, withdrawn. A thing that had never happened before in sovereignty history. A procedural earthquake that sent shockwaves through 47 civilizations simultaneously. What replaced it was drafted on a whiteboard in a Geneva conference room by Osaibansu, a legal team of 7, Vulcan, and his chief treaty advisor. It was messy and argued over and revised 43 times. It was called the Nairobi Accord. Equal recognition, voluntary cooperation, free exchange of scientific and cultural knowledge, a joint exploration charter, a permanent mutual diplomatic presence, a formal prohibition on demonstration strikes on inhabited or uninhabited territories, a clause everyone understood was directed specifically at Draxon, whose trial was already being scheduled. No tribute, no resource extraction, no FTL moratorium. It was signed in Nairobi, under an open sky, with both human and sovereignty officials present. Vulcan signed with a human pen, ballpoint, blue ink, because someone had handed it to him, and he hadn't thought to ask for anything else. Photographers caught him looking at it afterward, turning it over in his fingers with an expression of quiet wonder, 12 years later. The galaxy did not change overnight. It changed the way most real things change, slowly, quietly, through the accumulation of small moments that only looked inevitable in retrospect. The Nairobi Accord sparked exactly what Vulcan had suspected it would. Once other civilizations saw that the compact could be withdrawn, that the sovereignty could be negotiated with rather than submitted to, they began asking questions they had never felt safe asking before. Not all of them renegotiated their terms. Some were too deeply integrated, too economically dependent on sovereignty infrastructure to rock the boat. But the silence broke. The questions were asked. And in the Sovereignty Council chambers, for the first time in centuries, the assumption of total compliance stopped being the starting point. The Thre Collective, the Venn Choir, and the Loom became Earth's first formal alien partners. Not grand alliances, not military pacts, but genuine friendships between peoples who had watched each other from a distance for a long time and finally said hello. The Venn Choir sent musicians to Earth. The Loom sent weavers. The Thre sent historians and received historians in return. And the resulting cultural exchange produced scholarship so dense and extraordinary that the universities publishing it had to create entirely new academic departments to contain it. Fleet Admiral Draxon was court-martialed by the Sovereignty Council 8 months after the standoff. Not on human request, on sovereignty initiative, because his unauthorized strike had violated 17 separate articles of Compact Protocol. He was stripped of his rank and removed from service. He spent his remaining years writing his memoirs, which sold poorly because he still didn't understand what had happened, and it showed. Junior Assessor Pirate Callas was quietly promoted 3 times in 2 years. She was eventually appointed to head the Sovereignty's newly created Emergent Civilization Relations Division, a body designed, explicitly, to replace the old compact model with something that involved actually talking to species before assuming they'd comply. She kept a framed copy of her original flagged report on her office wall. Not out of pride, she told people, but as a reminder that sometimes the correct instinct is the one everyone tells you to ignore. Amara Osaibansu served 2 more terms as Secretary General, then retired to Ghana, where she taught political theory at the University of Ghana. She refused to write a memoir, insisting that her students were more interesting than her past. She kept one souvenir on her desk, a ballpoint pen, blue ink, identical to the one Vulcan had used to sign the accord. Not the original, she'd let him keep that, but a match. Vulcan retired from diplomatic service and wrote a book. It was, for an alien political memoir, surprisingly honest. He described the moment he'd heard the laughter, the long days of recalculation, the private conversation in Geneva. He described signing with a human pen and the strange smallness of the object and the strange weight of the moment. The book was read across the sovereignty, widely, by adults but also, gradually, by students, assigned in schools as an example of what contact with an unexpected civilization can teach. The most read section, the one excerpted in textbooks and quoted in graduation speeches, and painted in large letters on the wall of the Sovereignty Diplomatic Academy, was a single paragraph from Chapter 9. It described the original moment of first contact, and it ended like this. They laughed. I did not understand it then. I have spent 12 years trying to find the right word in our language for what that laughter was. I have not found one. In Thre, we have no word for a species that has survived everything and is still, somehow, delighted to be alive. Perhaps we needed to meet humanity before we could invent one. And in classrooms across the sovereignty, in languages that had never had a word for that particular human quality, young people read that paragraph, looked up from their texts, and felt something stir in them, something quiet and persistent and difficult to name. Their teachers filed it under curiosity. That wasn't wrong, but it was also something else. It was the particular feeling of hearing a story and knowing, somewhere deep and wordless, that it isn't finished yet. The galaxy was enormous. Humanity had barely begun. And somewhere out in the dark between the stars, something old and strange and interesting was waiting to find out what happened when it met a species that laughed.